Hey there folks, Wrel here. In the background you'll see some gameplay from Far Cry 3 as I share some thoughts on better gaming. And today we're going to be talking about violence in video games, its effects on us as individuals, as well as the influence it has on our society. I've been thinking a lot about how to address this issue. Gamers don't want to have their favorite games taken away from them, game developers don't want to lose sales because of it, parents want to keep their children from becoming warped psychopaths, and the media outlets are constantly pointing to video games as being the reason for it. Because of all of this, it's a very difficult conversation to have. Everyone has an interest to protect, and no one has proof. People are scared, confused, and want something to blame for the tragedies in our society. But this shouldn't really come as a surprise, as in the 1910s, jazz music was blamed for drunkenness, deafness, and unwed mothers. In the 1950s, comic books were blamed for teenage crime. Books, newspapers, movies, television, the internet, if it exists as a form of entertainment media, you can bet that it's been blamed for society's afflictions. However, an important distinction between those mediums and video games, at least the violent ones, is that you're holding the fate of another virtual human being in the palm of your hands. There's interactivity there. When someone is killed in a book or a movie, that story has already been written. It's a passive experience. But when someone is killed in a game, you're the one writing the story and pulling the trigger. It's an active experience. So it begs the question, do violent video games make us more violent individuals? Do they blur the lines between real and make-believe so much that our actions translate from one reality to the next? I can't cover everything, obviously, but here's the gist of what we think we know so far. Many independent studies have been done over the past couple of decades, and most of them find something linking violent video games to short-term aggression. However, the results are always debatable at best and skewed to support a hypothesis at worst. These studies usually mention that the correlation does not indicate causation. And to confuse things a little bit more, one study published by Paul Adachi at the Brock University in 2011 linked competition to aggression more so than violent content. The experiment had participants play a violent and competitive game, a violent and non-competitive game, a non-violent and competitive game, and a non-violent and non-competitive game. Those games were Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, Left 4 Dead 2, Fuel, and Marble Blast Ultra. According to Adachi, irrespective of violent content, the most competitive games produced the most aggressive behavior. That suggests that competition has a greater influence on aggression than violence. So it probably goes without saying that trying to prove the violence plus video games equals aggression formula is ignoring other variables. In fact, let's rewind back to 2001, where a meta-analysis published by Professor John L. Sherry from Purdue University incorporated 25 independent studies related to violent video games. A meta-analysis is useful for taking multiple studies and trying to remove bias, trying to create a more consistent picture by compiling the results. So in short, the three main conclusions that came from it were that, number one, there is a small effect of video game play on aggression, and the effect is smaller than the effect of violent television on aggression. Number two is that the type of violence contained in the games is a predictor of aggression, with human and fantasy violence being associated with stronger effects than sports violence. And number three is that there is a trend suggesting that longer playing times result in less aggression. That last one I find personally interesting. Why would playing a violent video game for longer periods make you less aggressive than shorter periods? In this meta-analysis, the studies conducted gave participants anywhere from 5 minutes to 75 minutes of playtime per session. Sherry went on to mention that playing for 5 minutes may be too short for participants to get a grasp on the game, which leads to frustration, and that 75 minutes may be longer than participants actually want to play the game for, which leads to boredom. Two studies done in 1995, both using Mortal Kombat, which if you've never played Mortal Kombat before, trust me that it's just ridiculously violent, especially for the time. So, two studies, Mortal Kombat, but one had players play for only 10 minutes, and the other had players play for 75 minutes. The participants who played for only 10 minutes had notably higher levels of aggression than those who played for longer. And this leads me to the next and very recent study published in March of this year by researchers from the University of Oxford, University of Rochester, and a company called Immersive. The study concludes that it's the difficulty of a game that gives rise to aggressive thoughts or actions, not the amount of violent content. According to Andrew Shabilsky, an experimental psychologist at Oxford and the lead author of the paper, he said that difficulty was a consistent, robust predictor that accounted for a certain share of variability in aggressive feelings and thoughts and behaviors. We didn't once find a content effect. One of the tests performed during the study was using a game of Tetris, which is probably one of the most harmless games you can think of, and had participants play two versions. One version was just normal Tetris, and the other version was modified to give the player the wrong piece 78% of the time. So when you look at that conclusion, the earlier two studies that used Mortal Kombat make a little bit more sense, don't they? If you play a game for only 10 minutes, you probably suck at it. You're still learning the controls, you're trying to get used to the game, and the longer you play, the better you get at the game, or at the very least you begin to understand it more. Good games are meant to continually challenge you, but not discourage and frustrate you. That's why you see games that start out relatively easy, then they introduce new mechanics, new monsters, new levels and bosses. They ramp up the difficulty over time so that you make progress. So what does that say for games that aren't built that way? Maybe, say, a game where you're thrown in the middle of a battle and you constantly die over and over and over with very little guidance or anything you can do about it. But, not to bring this too far off topic, that's what we know so far. Short-term aggression exists due to playing games. Whether it's because of violence, difficulty, or competition, we really can't say for certain just yet. And it's possible that we'll never know for sure. As of April 2013, in the United States, an estimated 97% of adolescents play video games. 97%. If violent video games made us violent individuals, with 97% of kids playing games, and with 11.21 million copies of Grand Theft Auto 5 sold within the first 24 hours of launch, I'm pretty sure that we'd be feeling the repercussions of that a year later. But we're not. In fact, violent crime rates have been on the decline since the late 1990s. Statistically, we're living in one of the safest times in our nation's history. But it also feels like we're seeing more and more mass shootings. Why is that? The answer is just that the media picks and chooses what they want to show. In actuality, the number of mass shootings is not trending upwards, but the majority of them tend to happen privately, within a family, and while they are no less tragic, it doesn't make for as good a headline as something that happens out in the open. Still, when it comes to the more public mass murders, the media often places huge emphasis on violent video games, so it at least warrants discussion. Like we mentioned earlier, the evidence doesn't really support violent content in video games being a predictor of aggression. However, certain types of individuals may be more attracted to playing violent video games. A recent study from The Ohio State University and the University of Luxembourg concluded that participants who were denied the opportunity to participate in taboo acts, like being able to cheat on a test, were more likely to choose a violent video game to play in order to engage in those taboo acts that were originally denied. So in other words, they were frustrated that they couldn't do something, and then they chose the next best thing. To build on that, a study done in 2010 by the Villanova University and the Rutgers University suggests that violent video games only cause aggressive feelings in individuals who had a pre-existing disposition, such as high neuroticism, low agreeableness, or low conscientiousness. And if this is really the case, then you're talking about violent video games as a symptom, not a cause. I do, however, think that it would be safe to say that video games could give someone ideas. After all, advertising, television, video games, it all affects social norms and how we perceive them. When I was younger, I watched Power Rangers and I wanted to be a Power Ranger. I ran around the house fighting imaginary bad guys, I was jumping off of furniture, doing flying sidekicks. That interest in being a Power Ranger carried on into my later years, but manifested into something more socially acceptable in the form of martial arts. So if you have someone too young to distinguish reality from fiction, or if their mind operates differently due to mental illness or developmental issues, then that needs to be kept under a watchful eye. Video games are labeled in such a way that you can easily determine the type of content that's going to be present within that game. The ESRB rates things in a very clear-cut manner, T for teen, and for mature. Outside of the US, you have things like PEGI or SARO that rate video games along the same lines. The parent's primary responsibility should be to look out for their child, which includes keeping a handle on what you let them play and who you let them play with, at least while they're at home. You're not always going to have control over everything. I remember being a teenager too. But what you can have is an understanding of what kinds of struggles your child is facing in their life and at home. According to the Safe School Initiative final report in 2002 done by the Secret Service, a few of the key factors that they determined among school shootings was that the shooter did not suddenly snap. They had an idea, they formulated a plan, and they found the tools that they needed and then executed. Most attackers had difficulty coping with significant losses or personal failures, and many of them had considered or attempted suicide. They also found that shooters were not the only people who knew about the plan. Just as a quote, "Prior to most incidents, other people knew about the attacker's idea and/or plan to attack. In most cases, those who knew were other kids, friends, schoolmates, siblings, and others." It's because of that if you think that there is a problem, you need to talk to someone. If you're a friend, a sibling, a schoolmate, a parent, a teacher, you need to prevent things from happening. Never take threats with a grain of salt. So, just to recap everything again, there may be a link between violent video games and short-term aggression, but it's being contested by more recent studies that point toward other factors, and no long-term links have been found just yet. In regards to violent video games appearing in the media alongside mass shootings, it's worth investigating further, of course, but it seems like violent video games are not a cause, but are a symptom. There are ways that we can prevent these tragedies from happening, but we have to be able to recognize the warning signs. There is no one person to blame. There is no one thing to blame. There's no big bad corporation that's stealing away your children's innocence. It's just that society is evolving. If 97% of kids today are playing video games, you can bet that the next time that a crime happens, it'll be committed by someone who has played video games, probably even a violent video game, at one point in their life. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and I know that this is a hot button topic right now, but I would like to hear your take on things in the comment section down below. Keep it civil, keep it respectful, and try not to let your emotions get in the way of your judgment. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.